Okay, so good day, everybody. We would like to welcome Mr. Niki Braithwaite to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you, Niki. So let me just start by introducing our guest here. So Niki Braithwaite is a seasoned professional in Trinidad and Tobago's public sector with over 13 years of experience as an industry specialist at the Ministry of Trade and Industry. Throughout his tenure, Brathwaite has contributed to the country's economic development through his expertise in policy development, stakeholder management, monitoring and evaluation, research, and business development. Brathwaite holds a master's in international relations and a bachelor's in government with a minor in international relations. His academic interests are deeply rooted in Latin American history and politics, an area that he has taught, researched, and published and presented for extensively. His work includes survey research on security issues in the Caribbean, with case studies focusing on Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname. So we have a lot to talk about today, Mr. Brathwaite. Thank you for coming on to the podcast with me.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be
Yeah,
on.
yeah, no problem. So I guess we could start with how would you define or how do you approach, you know, your philosophy as an industry specialist with the in what you do?
Well, my philosophy is very simple. Israeli is in an alignment with the government everyday vision, which is basically um, being more and more developed, but a focus on in developing SMEs, small and medium enterprises, making them more competitive, not only locally, regionally, but globally. So one of the mandates of the ministry will be the whole question of diversification, moving away from the reliance on the hydrocarbons. And it goes into areas of manufacturing where there can be light manufacturing, services, and a number of sectors so through food and beverage, um, energy byproducts. So there's a focus on the non-energy side of things, and
Right.
that is what. So my philosophy is really to move any country since in a post independence era, right? 21st century going to be a more not only industrialized but have a mixed, a diversified approach in how we develop.
Yeah. I mean, diversification. We've been hearing about the need to diversify in
Yeah.
Trinidad and Tobago for time immemorial.
Yes.
And, you know, we are sort of entering into an era globally where the time to diversify, we're sort of running out of time. If not, we have run out of time. So,
Mhm.
like, what would you say are like the pressing challenges facing Trinidad and Tobago's trade and industry today?
I think the present challenge is a heavy reliance on the not only hydrocarbons but the revenues generated from the hydrocarbons to focus on the diversified areas. Um, Personally, I think there should be not too much uh, investment into that sector, but more investment on the non-energy sector. And that way, it allows not only government but private sector to be a little more innovative, and more creative, right, and trying to have an understanding of the global trends. For example, if you look at in the Middle East, you see Saudi Arabia, their model of development where there's a decreasing, yes, they would have relied on the hydrocarbon sector, but you see they moving away from it, and whatever profits and revenues that have generated from that went into other areas, right? But it's also not only about diversifying, but also being able to be sustainable in your development. Through the whole green, the idea of the green economy, right? Renewable energy, cutting and saving costs in the traditional sense, right? And I'm moving that approach to other areas where funds can be saved, money can be saved and put into other areas, whether the social services, diversification in gender, right? And that should be the focus, being sustainable in the long term.
Yeah. So what are the opportunity areas that you have seen in Trinidad and Tobago outside of the
Oh,
oil
well,
and gas industry?
well, opportunities is across sectors. multitude of sectors. So while in the energy, there's a renewable sense, but we have not really dive headstrong into that so much. We started off, yes, with the whole idea of maybe solar power, uh, providing incentives for those who in the whole renewable energy thing, which is solar, through electric, because you see that direction of electric vehicles becoming more and more prevalent. Um, and I think also opportunities, the whole idea of teaching our fellow citizens to be a little more entrepreneurial in spirit, a little more innovative. And there's many opportunities for that, whether in the IT sector, um, food and beverage, where we have local products, the agriculture sector, where we have the cocoa, sugar. There's so many opportunities
I
and
mean,
products. That
I mean,
whole
one
question of
example.
value added and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just on that, just a funny little side note. There is one product, well, two products, because I'm in Poland right now. There are two products
Mm.
from Trinidad, three products. I just thought of a third one. Three
Okay.
products from Trinidad and Tobago that I see regularly in Poland. One is called Trinidad Scorpion.
Pepper.
So that is the pepper sauce, right?
Yeah.
And so I started to see that be introduced into the local market here, Trinidad and Tobago, specifically the Maruga Scorpion, is a quite popular brand and world renowned. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, this is an area where we you know, where we're present. Of course, Angostura rum, right? So
Correct.
the alcohol. But I think
And the bitters is
and right, that was the third one. The
bitters,
bitters is this is you every bar you go into in Poland, serious
correct?
establishment, you would
Mm,
see Angostura bitters inside of there. So, you know, I just remember like I went out with some friends and I was in a bar and some random person just like, oh, do you like some bitters? And I was literally shocked. I was like, wait, let me check the label on the bitters, and I saw it was a product of Trinidad and Tobago, and I did feel a sense of pride there,
mhm,
you know. So yeah, I mean, these are areas. I mean, what my father, you know, he speaks a lot about the potential Trinidad and Tobago has, specifically in the maritime sector.
mhm.
What are your thoughts on that? I mean, for sure, there's a lot of potential
Oh
there,
yes, definitely.
you know, to sort of in terms of the diversification
Mm,
process in Trinidad and Tobago. But you know, my experience in Trinidad, and I think that this is an international experience too, is that there's a lot of red tape, a lot of bureaucratic hurdles that make
mhm,
that it kills the entrepreneurial spirit essentially
mhm.
in a lot of Trinidadians because I do strongly believe that Trinidadians are naturally entrepreneurial. We're naturally entrepreneurial people, but a lot of our entrepreneurial spirit is sort of killed by the whole bureaucratic process.
Yes,
So it's,
and
you
not
know,
only not only the entrepreneurial spirit, but the whole issue of investment. Because as you mentioned, the maritime sector, for us, the maritime is coincides with the yachting sector. So for the yachting, when we have the cruisers, the people of the yachties, as we call yachties, uh, and you mentioned the whole red tape bureaucratic, the whole question of um, the immigration procedures is very, very cumbersome. It's very tiring. It's very long. It's very bureaucratic. And what people, not many people realize, that Trinidad and Tobago actually has the advantage of being geographically located out of the hurricane belt.
right.
And to use that as a competitive advantage, we need to have the border agencies on board and understanding the potential that the visitors bring in terms of foreign exchange to the economy. And yes, having the idea of rigid standard operating of procedures, they have to understand the bigger picture of the potential and the value and the investment that brings in terms of foreign exchange earnings. And that is also a mindset, as you say, with the red tape and those in authority that have to bear in mind.
What are the main hurdles you would say to, what are the main hurdles that we are facing in the
And so the
diversification
main
process, in the
hurdle
trade process?
well, for example, in that example of the maritime, the main hurdle will be the shift of the cultural thinking of yes, they are used to processing documents, visitors a certain way, but not adapting to the more technological because there are technological advancements in processing. So the cost of processing times for visitors significantly. from days, weeks to a matter of hours, right? And the whole cultural mindset has to change from those mainly in public service border agencies.
I mean,
And I think
you
that would
just
be main hurdle for me.
I mean, you just talked about like we us needing a sort of a cultural change now. How do you, I mean, I can't even begin to think about how we go around addressing, let's say, the cultural hurdle
Mm-hmm.
that we face. Like what is
It's,
how do we
it's,
do that?
it can be a challenge because we, for example, at the ministry, we would have developed uh, a revised standard operating procedures, which is more user-friendly, visitor-friendly. Um, it was so bad that we ourselves, we couldn't get a consultant to actually show the border and agencies how to do it. We actually had to send it for themselves and let them do it. But it remains to be seen if we actually did reviewed what we revised, what should be the procedure in terms of the international best practices,
Yeah,
what should have been operating. Because we in Trinidad, we could be losing our income or visitors to countries like Grenada, St. Martin, all up the islands, St. Lucia, even though they are at the risk of being in the path of hurricane, but they haven't taken a different approach, a more modern approach, a more user-friendly approach
yeah.
that makes it um, friendlier for people to visit.
I wonder if that's because, it's kind of necessary in their case, whereas previously we've been able to sort of lay back a little bit and rely on the oil
Yeah,
and gas sector, whereas
yeah,
the other islands don't really have that luxury. And
correct.
then, it's therefore they would have had to implement, bit more
Yeah,
innovative on that
correct.
side. Like, but let's just stay on the trade side up for a little longer. What are
Mm.
Trinidad and Tobago's main trading partners?
So our main trading partners, again, back to the hydrocarbons with the reliance on the energy sector. To the
Right.
states, the CARICOM, those areas were more the downstream products, ammonia, natural gas, whatever, those downstream products, those are major trading partners. Now, when it comes to maybe the non-energy side of things, CARICOM, where we export a lot of our um, uh, food and beverage products. I recently, a few years ago, we tried to have a tap into other markets like Cuba, Costa Rica, where we, through our agencies, will have done like market survey research to kind of get a sense of what is the demand. Cuba particularly will be more focused on the tourism sector, the hotel industry, where they'll have certain food and beverage products. But that is just in the main, where we have the premium products, like you mentioned, the Angostura bitters, that is strategically worldwide, where Angostura bitter is a household product that we found in bars. It's a key ingredient in a lot of the cocktails that we drink. Um, Another opportunity would be cocoa. Our cocoa is world renowned and can be manufactured as a premium product with the right resources, the right inputs that can be placed in, strategically in other markets, European markets, and so on.
Yeah.
So
And
there are opportunities there.
yeah. What about like what is our trade volume like, for instance, with Venezuela, Mexico, Brazil, the big boys beside the United States of the Americas?
Usually, for those bigger markets, volumes would be significant, but the terms of trade would not usually favor us. Um, Again, it depends on where our strengths are. And I can't remember on the top of my head, but some of the markets, particular markets, based on our survey, market survey research, will require a certain product. Um, what I've observed, the focus has been not only the traditional markets, but we need to we also been looking at emerging markets where we have Costa Rica, where we have Colombia, we have Chile, Curacao. So we are developing what we call partial scope agreements. Partial scope agreement is partial in scope, not controlling entirety of all goods and services and so on, but selected goods and services. So those are really targeted emerging markets. Also, we've made inroads into the African market, where we've tried to look at Ghana in particular. We recently conducted a trade mission in Ghana. So a lot of these strategies in place through various trade missions. We've also adopted strategies for the establishment of what we call commercial attaches, where we place people in strategic markets for them to gain insight to what are the demands of what Trinidad and what are some of the opportunities, but not only Trinidad, but Trinidad firms that can
Right.
get into.
And how, like, when you do when you do this research, how do you communicate the results of those
Well, use
research that you do to the, let's say, to prospective entrepreneurs who would like to enter into these foreign markets, like small and medium-sized
so
companies?
so there are a number of strategies. So one would be, for example, we have one of the agencies under the purview of the ministry to go into the market, gather information. So I can give you an example for Cuba. Within Cuba, we have what we call a trade facilitation office, which is essentially a conduit between the Cuban market and the Trinidadian economy. They work very closely with the Cuban Chamber of Commerce, and they actually identify who are some of the potential buyers. For example, Cuba being primarily state-oriented would have agencies that are state agencies but would have identified specific products. So, for example, hotel industry would require, say, like the food and beverage. We have any the non any energy where some an agency may require certain energy products. Another one may be involved in like manufacturing where require maybe some electronic products, wiring, that sort of thing. And what essentially that office, the trade facilitation office, it matches the potential buyer from Cuba with our exporters in Trinidad. And once that is done, we carry a group of people to Cuba to meet the potential to have these B2B meetings also. Annually, there's this huge trade fair called FIHAB, which is the Havana Trade Fair, which is done every year, where the exporters from all over the world meet in Havana and have these B2B meetings, network, and so on, and have annually potential ban. It's actually quite successful for Trinidad, where we have a few exporters being successful.
Like, I'll give you like an example, like a scenario, let's say, because my mind's starting to run a little wild here.
Mm,
So I'm here in Warsaw, Poland, right?
mm,
And I see a market opportunity for some Trinidad and Tobago products to enter within the market in Trinidad and Tobago, right? Within Poland. Say I want to
mm,
bring in Trinidad pepper sauce, the Maruga
mm,
scorpion from one of our many, um, you know, let's say, boot, one of our many small producers.
mm.
How can I go around asking for help or facilitation of that process from, let's say, the ministry? Is there help that the ministries do to help facilitate the process, for
Yeah,
instance?
certainly one way of doing that would be probably at the mission, the diplomatic mission level. So wherever we, for example, we're in Brussels or Geneva, whoever's there that is accredited to say like in Poland, to make that connection. So you, for example, if there's an opportunity, you can approach our mission there. And there we may not all missions would have a commercial unit, so to say, and you make that connection. Um, but that connection involves a lot of these stakeholders meeting, for example, who are the potential buyers in Poland, yourself being the middleman,
Mhm.
connecting it with the mission, and that mission connects to us. And when it
Right.
connects us, it says, look, we have the potential buyers in so and so market where we can make the links. But it doesn't stop there. It will require further research, example, to see what who are the buyers. Also, we also have to operate within the parameters of trade agreements. So, for
Mhm.
example, we have with the EPA agreement with the European Union. So it has to be within the parameters of the agreement. What tariffs are there? What is bound? What is allowed? What is not allowed? And for example, if whoever the exporters would also have to abide by certain standards. So
Right.
there may be um, health or the food and safety requirements. What are the food and safety requirements
The
are
labeling
needed to enter?
requirements and
Yeah, labor requirements and so on. So,
so
so, so,
our
so
Mhm.
even though we have these opportunities, they're all governed by whatever the trade parameters are.
and our government through our embassies do offer sometimes
Yes, they can.
entrepreneurs
They
help?
can.
Wow.
Yes,
Okay. They
yes.
have a
And this is
commercial
why,
office, as you were saying.
yes. So this is why traditionally it hadn't always been the case, but recently we really started establishing what we call these commercial offices. Uh,
Like you say that, and I just kind of shake my head because I didn't know that, and I
right.
think a lot of Trinidad, I suspect that there's a lot of services that our embassies and our government, various different departments have on offer, but a lot of the population, and we're talking about entrepreneurs specifically, are not aware about
Yeah,
taking advantage of, let's say, these opportunities and these
yeah.
the aid that we may get from, let's say, the Ministry of Trade and
Yeah.
Commerce. So it's
And
like
that is
a
that,
process of communication,
of
essentially, and
course,
getting it out there.
and that is what prompted the whole idea of the establishment of these commercial offices, where it was lacking previously, the commercial element of doing trade between
Mhm.
countries. It was more focused on diplomatic services and so on. Because previously there may be somebody like yourself, you may be Joshua living in Poland, but there's an opportunity for Trinidad. What do we do?
Right,
Right? And now we have set up this system. And while we started with a few commercial officers, the goal is to kind of to establish more and more and build that network, right? And
right.
increase the channels of communication.
Yeah. I mean, this is very good information for our listeners to hear,
Mm,
specifically Trinidadians that are, not necessarily based in Trinidad but are outside, contact your embassy and see if they have a commercial office. They
mm,
may have that and that may help, in, in your ideas or actualizing your ideas. But
yes.
your background, I mean, I feel like trade and international relations are kind of linked, especially for smaller countries, right?
Mm,
I mean, I think specifically, in like the Vietnamese population in
mm,
Poland, like um, their embassy here, there's a very robust commercial section which
mm,
helps the diaspora in Poland essentially get involved in the local Trinidad market and the export import, and there's a lot of support there. And Trinidad is hopefully will go harder down that route.
mm.
But your background is in international relations. Like, how does that like shape your approach to industry policy exactly?
So it allows me to appreciate actually how small we are in the whole grand scheme of things in terms of the global dynamics. Um, and what we have to do in order to be a key player, whether through diplomacy, through international trade, um, and a multitude of issues on issues of security, um, and security it itself is a broad concept from the social point of view, the economic point of view, political point of view, and whatnot. So I think my background in international relations helps me to understand where we stand and what we need to do in order to do well in the international in the global arena.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that sort of comes to my mind when I think about what you just said is Venezuela, 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 Venezuela,
Mm,
Venezuela. And I'm willing to bet that we do not trade nearly as much as we should be with that
mm,
market. It is a,
mm.
it may not necessarily be a very wealthy market, but it's a
Yes,
massive market, right?
it
It's
is.
what millions and millions and millions of people, many times larger than Trinidad and Tobago. And I suspect that our trade volume with Venezuela is very low.
It is.
And why? Why is that? Is it a language barrier issue when it comes to engagement with the wider Latin American region? We
I
can't speak Spanish, we can't speak Portuguese. Is it that we don't have the products? Why isn't there more of an exchange of goods between Trinidad and Tobago and, let's say, the Latin American region?
I think it's a very good question because from my understanding, I remember, for example, when I was in Venezuela a few years ago when I was in university and seeing Venezuela, this is at the time when Hugo Chavez was alive.
Right.
And Venezuela tended to be, uh, they were funded heavily by the hydrocarbon sector and tended to be a bit closed off from the rest of the hemisphere in terms of trading environment. Uh, Using that sociological sort of strategy where they traded mainly with Cuba in a sort of bartering arrangement. We have this good, we share with this good, and so on. Not so much money exchange of funds. Um, in terms of our experience with Petro-Caribe, where we weren't involved in it, but Petro-Caribe, where the rest of the islands relying heavily on receiving petroleum products, but at discounted prices, right? And that kind of, I would say, maybe put us to the side in terms of the opportunities, because that focus was more on a socialist, looking after the smaller economies, where Trinidad and Tobago at the time had been thriving in other areas. So I think the, the nuances or the history of our trading relations it actually is really influenced by the policies of those in government, especially from the Venezuelan side, where the focus is not so much on with trading, it's free trading, it's capitalist in terms of that ideological thinking, right? And I think so the whole history of Trinidad and Venezuela relations, I think, has to do more with the ideological point of view. Maybe that divergence, maybe a slight divergence in ideologies in how we trade, right? Um, and also the trading where we have what we have in common in terms of the hydrocarbon sector, the sharing of the fields out there. That is the strategic that is a strategy that would have been established years and kind of solidified throughout the years. Um, but I think in terms of how we trade is really influenced by the ideology, I would more say.
So, but is there like a lot of like, let's say, hurdles? Is there restrictions on the entry of Trinidad goods into Venezuela? Or like, or vice
Um,
versa, for instance, Venezuelan goods. Like, I'm thinking about besides the oil and gas, where we are competitors with Venezuela.
mhm,
Like, what about wood and construction materials and food
yeah.
stuff and, other sort of services? And because my, why can't we enter that market? Why haven't
That's a
we? And
good
vice
question.
versa.
I think I would say it's because Venezuela kind of they have a diversified, they're kind of similar to us, where they would have kind of been able to produce their own things, food and beverage, whatever, on their own.
Mhm.
And again, it's based on the policies that would have been implemented previously by Chavez, where the monies they earn, it goes into their own local production. So it was really um, they've they've implemented a lot of what you call the import substitution policies, where instead of importing certain products, they actually make it for their own. So I can give you an example of an experience I had when I went into Venezuela. They've had at the community level would have set up factories that made shoes, made certain products, and that is something an import substitution strategy would have been implemented for there. And I think that was kind of widespread throughout the other sectors. So they more relied on self-sustaining, being able to produce for themselves. And if they produce for themselves, they're able to produce for other countries. And trade was, for example, like-minded ideological systems like Cuba and whatnot. And
But
also Venezuela, if you look in terms of the trading that is heavily influenced by ideology, they would have had a good relationship with Iran, good relationship with Russia, good relationship with China, right? Huge markets. So they would have been able to benefit uh, based on those relationships, being able to import if they had to import products that needed to be complemented with what they have, they'll probably source from those countries. Again, based on the ideologies.
with an
Right? And
ideologically
I
driven
think,
sort of focus.
yes, I believe so. That is my understanding.
Yeah. Is there like tension between Trinidad and Venezuela? Like with the Petro-Caribbean initiative,
No,
they had to. Mhm.
I don't think there was tension. I think it was more. I mean, Venezuela and Trinidad always operated more on a mutual respect. Right? I don't think that there was any tension in terms of because again, Trinidad would have other opportunities in terms where our strength was not so much the the refining of crude oil, and our strength was more the downstream sector, petrochemicals and what, and that we all have already had markets well-established markets in that regard. Um, but Venezuela was in a position to provide more crude, more of the refined product out of crude oil to those countries. They also had the capacity to do so where we may not have had that kind of capacity of Venezuela to produce however many barrels a day and refine those products to be able to export to those countries. So I think it's one where there was mutual respect and understanding that yes, our competitive advantage is in this, we are able to do that. Our competitive advantage is in this, we'll be able to do that. But throughout history, we've always had that whole mutual respect. Sure.
That's interesting. I mean, so okay, so we have Venezuela and Trinidad within the Caribbean region, or we Latin American region,
Mm.
who were producing oil and gas, and now we have a new player with Guyana,
Correct.
right? So, you know, previously Guyana was not a competitor of Trinidad and
Mm.
Tobago in this regard. Now it is, right?
It
And
is.
there is also tension between the Essequibo region, between
Correct.
Venezuela
Mm.
and Guyana.
Yeah.
And now, Guyana's sort of competing now with Trinidad in the oil and gas sector. Talk to me
Mm.
about this sort of re the relationship between Guyana and Trinidad, the prior trade relationship. What is the new trade relationship like, and how that has evolved?
So prior to the Guyana's recent discovery of all these oil fields and so on, our relationship with Guyana will have been pretty much like what the rest of CARICOM, being trading partners within that region, whatever products, that was normal. Now being a game player, a major game player in the petroleum sector, I think it presents an opportunity for Trinidad having that experience, especially with the downstream industry. We can lend some of that expertise. And as a matter of fact, we have a lot of these service providers, goods and services providers currently in Guyana that will actually help them grow their industry in the field of services, energy services. There are a lot of companies that go there, provide energy services in that burgeoning sector, uh, logistics. We have companies that deal with logistics in terms of transport of materials, goods, and so on. So at this point, I think again, similar to Venezuela, there's one of mutual respect, mutual cooperation, the whole idea of South-South cooperation, all of that is, and we would have seen um, uh, a healthy relationship between the President Ufanali and our Prime Minister, where not only we collaborate on the industry sector, but there's also uh, uh, how I say there's also the willingness to develop the agricultural sector because both leaders realize that we can't, again, Guyana may be learning from the mistakes of Trinidad and Tobago. They
I
say,
hope
look,
so.
we can't rely too much on the hydrocarbons, but the other sectors, and Guyana, as you know, even though offshore they're very rich, certainly internally they're very rich in terms of the land space and what products or what agriculture it could be. So I think there's also some an arrangement that's beneficial to both parties where not only hydrocarbons, but in terms of exchange of like knowledge transfer, technology transfer, and so on, but in the areas of where we have the technology and knowledge transfer in the hydrocarbons and the petroleum, the Guyana, same could be applied to the agriculture sector, right? For
Yeah.
example, what I've understood is opportunities for some products like rice, right? Sugar to an extent. Although we've kind of gotten rid of the sugar industry, there's still further opportunities, right? Um, and from my point of view, I remember when I visited Brazil, and when I went to Brazil, I remember seeing all these mini cars, compact size cars, and there were so many of them. But I wonder why there's so many. And what I understood, and in Brazil, what they do, they don't import a lot of fuel for their consumption. What they do, they have this hybrid of ethanol and fuel. And those cars are retrofitted to have engines for ethanol. But in order to produce ethanol, you go the sugar and go the sugar and the ethanol, there's this hybrid thing. And this is something I felt at the time, and we could still learn, apply those, implement those kind of things in within Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago. So those
Yeah.
some of the things that we can look at, those are opportunities.
So a lot of our, let's say, what I gathered you said is that a lot of our industry leaders within the oil and gas sector, the logistics and the downstream sort of industries, we are operating in Guyana now
Yeah,
to aid them in
yeah,
that effort.
yeah.
My initial thought, I mean, I don't know, was that we would have more of an adversarial relationship with
Mm,
Guyana with regard to, with regard to the oil and gas sector. But, I was also in Guyana 2 years ago
mm,
with Derek, and where we were providing services for a new oil and gas company that had
yeah,
just opened there. So there's that relationship. And I know that there's a lot of other companies
mm,
um from Trinidad dealing in the logistics sites who are also operating in
yeah,
Guyana right now.
yeah.
And Guyana's discovery of this oil and gas has essentially catapulted them into geopolitical relevance.
Of course,
So much so that, Venezuela is threatening to invade Guyana.
correct.
And I wonder, like, how do we navigate that tension between Venezuela and Guyana?
Okay,
Trinidad
so
specifically, because we're in a situation where we have, Trinidad, Venezuela's a really big country,
yeah,
right next to us. They are potential security threat. And
mm,
further to this end, I know that the United States and Trinidad and Tobago just extended, or they wrote an agreement, I think it was November or December 2024, allowing
yeah,
the Americans to offer military aid to Trinidad in the event of any sort of conflict, right? And I think a lot of this is in anticipation or to, let's say, mitigate the risks that Venezuela poses on regional stability specifically. So I just kind of wondering, like, how does Trinidad and Tobago manage, this tension between two allies, between
um,
Venezuela and Guyana, between us, and how do we not allow that to affect our trade relationships and our economic relationships with both of these countries?
so, so Trinidad and Tobago, as you would know, is we've always, and this is since the days of Eric Williams, 50s, 60s, that we've always adopted the approach of non-interventionism, also being neutral, while maintaining healthy relationships with all parties, all other parties. And in adopting that stance, we recognize that, yes, and this is Dr. Rowley, and this is no secret, government of Trinidad and Tobago has pronounced it and said, look, we've always been considered neutral, not interfering in the affairs of countries or affairs of, between two countries. Now, I think this provides the opportunity for Trinidad and Tobago, like other countries would have done in the past, encouraging those in conflict to pursue the diplomatic route, whether through the medium of a regional organization, CARICOM being involved, level of the OAS, if it has to reach there. Um, from the Venezuelan point of view, they would have their regional blocks, and those. So there is an opportunity for dialogue, for peaceful dialogue. So there are peaceful means. So I think Trinidad, yes, while looking on the outside, all those countries, Guyana, Venezuela, understand our position and they know our position and we do not get involved and they respect us, right? And having them respect our position, I think it allows for further dialogue, to seek peaceful means and yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that comes to mind is that I wonder if in this new era with Trump's second presidency, the second coming of Trump, if neutrality is even possible, right? I mean, when you look at what Trump is saying specifically regard to wanting to take over the Panama Canal, you know, you're looking at, the severe ideological differences between the Trump administration and Venezuela specifically. Well, that's like how, how do these threats affect our relationships, economic relationships with the United States, with Panama, with these
Yeah.
players? How do we
It
mitigate
is,
that?
I must admit, a very tricky situation in the advent of the second Trump presidency, because, as you know, Trinidad having this close relationship with Venezuela in terms of the oil and gas deals, which would not be too well received by the Trump administration, and there is a possibility of having been facing or experiencing sanctions as a result. Um, how do we navigate that if that is if that actually occurs? What will be the next steps? Again, The next steps occurring if it goes to that stage will be, of course, pursuing the diplomatic route. How it affects the relationship again, and what works to our advantage is that Trump hopefully will recognize that the relationship, the long-standing relationship between the United States of America and Trinidad and Tobago has always been a fruitful, healthy one. So that is the advantage we have in history, that we have always been a very good partner with the United States of America. Hopefully, they will also respect our position that we are a non-interventionist state. And when it comes to dictating the terms of our relationship between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela, and if it is dictated by the Americans, that is something I guess Trinidad and Tobago will have to tread extremely carefully on, not risking any diplomatic fallout, economic sanctions, and whatnot. So it is, I must admit, a very tricky environment that we are now. And we've seen it, we are seeing it happening with Trump's immigration policies, where he's sending back deportees to Mexico. Mexico refused it. We tried with Colombia. Colombia refused, but then they placed Colombia on some economic sanctions, even to the point where they withheld visa appointments.
I mean, I think Colombia very quickly, folded and accepted the deportation flights.
Correct.
So, we're entering I would say a time now where, and at least within the last 30 years, where the idea of CARICOM or Caribbean security becomes like a major issue. I feel like Trinidad and Tobago has essentially just, as you've sort of elaborated, we've sort of just held on to our non-aligned status, our neutral status. We want to trade with everybody best way we can. And, the old, let's say the last 30 years up to now, we've been able to fall back on international norms and international institutions to, negotiate and mediate conflicts. And I just wonder, how does the Ministry of Trade, how do people within that sector, how do you prepare? What are you doing to prepare yourselves for, like, let's say, this new security environment, specifically within the Caribbean region,
I would say that's a very good question. How do we prepare for that? I think at the ministry, like a lot of people, will certainly not have the answers for everything. But being prepared for it is I guess, I think, will be finding ways to instill confidence in importers and exporters. Continue, from our point of view, do the things the right way. If it comes to any stage of fallout, then that is something that has to be, I will guess, taken at the diplomatic level. Again, I'm not sure if you're aware that we've actually started to feel the effects of the Trump presidency, where he canceled some of the training with our defense force. They canceled actually the funding, because Trump's policy is that from the federal level, they're freezing all the grants, the foreign assistance, and so on. And we just what I read this morning, that they've canceled the military training exercises that's on between the American military and ours. So we feeling that effect. How we treat with that? Again, using our history, our diplomatic expertise, maybe that's a way of navigating it. I'm not sure if we are known for just accepting and laying back and other things, but I think Trinidad and Tobago has a history of being creative, of trying to work things out.
Yeah. And just to bring it back to Panama for a second,
Mm.
do we have any stakes in the ownership of the Panama Canal? We have a history, our people went there and helped build the Panama Canal.
Yes.
Trump's
So
takeover of the Panama Canal seems to be a serious one.
it seems to be a serious, but me honestly, Joshua, I think it's probably an empty threat, because there's no way, in my opinion, Trump will ever take ownership of the Panama Canal, because based on the history and what it do, is owned by the Canal Authority. Right? But as far as in terms of Trinidad and Tobago, I can see impact. And and when we mentioned the maritime sector before, what we've tried to do is to develop the sector in such a way where, the, in terms of the infrastructure development of the ports and so on, has to uh, be in alignment with the post-Panamax requirements for that canal. But there are plans, from our point of view, whether when Trump comes in, and if, God forbid, that does take over, it may change the certain arrangements. Um, but it does affect the way in terms of our maritime logistics. Um, and Trump, again, Trump having his empty sets, in my opinion, of taking over the canal, renaming the Gulf, taking over Greenland, is going to be a monumental task for him. Honestly, can't see that happening. Right? But again, it's important to be prepared for those eventualities.
Yeah. I mean, everyone thought that Putin wasn't going to go into Ukraine, and he did that,
He did.
and
Yeah,
they
he
caught
did.
themselves unprepared for that move.
Yeah.
And I think about China and Taiwan and that incoming conflict, and it just seems very on brand
Mm.
for Trump essentially to jump onto that bandwagon of the new era. Okay, if this is a new era you're wanted, fine, United States will play the games of this new time. And he's the Panama Canal, he's talking about the Gulf of America, right? The Greenland, and you're seeing this sort of like how he's like articulating that, right? And it's I wonder now about CARICOM now and Caribbean unity. Does Trinidad and Tobago trade a lot with Barbados? Do we trade a lot with Grenada? Do we trade a lot with Dominica, with Guyana, with Suriname? Do we have a lot of trade with these countries?
We do, but it's more, from my understanding, like the food and beverage sector. So there
Yeah.
are a lot of, you find like the snacks, some of the long-standing businesses, entrepreneurs like SM Jalil. You find a lot of the chubbies or the soft drinks. Uh, uh, and from the financial services point of view, where we have the public banks, we have set up the banks there. Uh, and so there is not only we trade in terms of light manufacturing and food and beverage product, but we have the services. Uh, there's also the whole question of commercial presence, where we have the Massy stores, so the Massy group of companies were established there on those islands. So I think that there is significant investment into those countries, um, and the trading environment I think is quite good at the CARICOM level.
Right. And we're talking about, I think the PNN administration have put it on the agenda about
Mm.
an inter-CARICOM
Very,
ferry,
yeah.
right? So the ferry from Trinidad to Barbados and not to
Yeah.
Guyana. And I wonder, like, what is your opinion on the inter-Caribbean ferry? Because I mean, as it's almost just as expensive for us to get to Barbados as it is to us to get to Miami.
Correct.
So why go to Barbados if I can go to Miami, right? So, this people to people exchange in the Caribbean, I think is unfortunately very, very low. Why is it so expensive for airfare to Barbados? Why is it so expensive to get to Grenada? Why is it so expensive to get to Guyana? And is the ferry a solution in that regard? Because
So,
you talked about the bigger companies, right? So the bigger companies have the capital to invest in these smaller Caribbean countries. But what about these small entrepreneurs, right? In terms of them getting involved in the Bayesian economy, in the Grenadian economy, the Dominican economy, or the Guyanese economy, right? Mm.
so I think with the aviation industry, I think is what our why it's so expensive. I think is mainly a reflection of a wider global issue because there are rising costs in the aviation industry worldwide. Uh, Rising costs due to number of reasons: economic, price of aviation fuel, security issues, right? Because the security issues not only at the level of terrorist threat, but there's also issues of from the mechanical side, I would say, in coming up with aircraft that are more secure. So when you coming up with aircraft that are more secure, more modern, it's more money. So it has that ripple effect. Um, so the rising cost of the aviation and so on and travel flying within the region is not unique to us. So I think that's a worldwide issue. And of course, those costs that I mentioned are associated with security issues, whatever, pass down to the customer, to the point of you see even the international airline charging for food to eat on the airline, charging for baggage allowances, because remember before we used to have to be able to carry on, now we have to pay for that, right? And the more baggage it is, the more expensive it is. Um, and as far as the idea of the ferry, I think it's a step in the right direction. I think it goes along with the pillars of what the CSME, with the whole idea of the free movement of people. So it is a step in the direction. It aligns with that philosophy of the CSME, where it speaks, which is a further iteration of the CARICOM agreement that exists. The CARICOM free trade and environment that exists. So the CSME takes a step further to allow the free movement of people, labor, goods. I remember for 2007 when we had the World Cup, the Cricket World Cup, that was an excellent example of implementation of free movement of people, where there weren't those passport restrictions. Yeah, you go to this Barbados, they stay for 3 months. So that model, I'm quite surprised why it was not implemented further. It seemed like it was just a trial run for that particular event, but it only stayed there. Now, similarly, hopefully it's easier with the ferry that we can implement that CSM the way it should.
Yeah. And I mean, if we just look at like Tobago and the reliance that Tobago has on the ferry itself, I remember when the ferry had
Mm.
shut down in Trinidad, it was, all hell on the political front until, Keith Rowley was able to bring in the new ferries into service. And I, you know, Tobago relies on the tourism that's coming from Trinidad and also the goods and the services of smaller players,
Yeah.
moving between Trinidad and Tobago. And I wonder about that opportunity there, with if we had a ferry, let's say
Mm.
going to Grenada, going to Barbados. Well, I mean, has any sort of like timeline been discussed internally that you're aware of regarding, the arrival of, let's say, a CARICOM ferry?
That's a good question, because I remember it was within last year they had discussed the whole regional ferry, I think between Grenada, Barbados. Um, it sounded at the time that it was something that would be soon. I'm not sure what has happened since, but at this point, I really can't see what the timelines in terms of making that a reality. But
Yeah.
again, sooner than later, it's the preferred option.
It would be, and it would be also electorally very, very popular
Yeah,
thing to do, if we could
yeah,
jump
yeah.
on our boat and go to Grenada for,
Of course.
400 TT or 500 TT this is
And
something that would be
not
extremely
only,
popular.
and Joshua, not only Grenada, but again, we spoke about Guyana earlier, because Guyana has that maritime interest where you could travel to Guyana. I'm not sure how the waters, how rough it is, but if it's possible, there's that opportunity as well in terms of Guyana becoming an emerging economy. It also provides for that trading opportunity. Uh, Along the river, the Demerara trade, there you go wherever you have to trade, and ships can actually pass through there. So that
Mhm.
is another opportunity there.
Yeah, I mean,
Guyana, we have Brazil, we have all these other countries.
I mean, I see, when I think about an inter-Caribbean ferry, I just, I think I get excited thinking about it essentially.
Mm.
And I think it would be something so popular,
Yes.
within the Trinidadian population, within Grenada, Guyana, it would be a very popular thing and initiative. And on top of that, yes, it would be a lot of subsidizing of the trip in order to make it cost effective. But that would be returned through economic sort of exchanges, as we see with the Tobago Trinidad link,
Yes,
right?
correct. Mm.
So, in your position and as a advisor, I would encourage you to say Trinidad Ferry. That's something that we need to bring
Yeah.
in. I mean, we're kind of running out of time already. We spoke for
Okay.
almost an hour. I have one more question for you before you go. If you could implement one transformative idea in Trinidad's trade and industry, what would it be?
Oh, one transformative idea, I think for me, very important, the whole idea concept of innovation. Very, very important. Innovation is for me is the basis of how you um, sell a product, improve on a product, and 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 having set up maybe at the institutional level facilities or structures that foster innovation. And this what inspired me was I remember when I went to Costa Rica, and there's this whole compound called Sabia de Ciudad, City of Knowledge, where Costa Rica they foster the idea of innovation across sectors. So for me, innovation is the key. It allows you to develop on what we have. We have a pan. How do we innovate the pan to be something different? How the manufacturing process, how we can we make it more different from what other people are doing? Because we invented it. We dictate the terms of that. How do we innovate on the value chain and the processes of manufacturing across the board, cocoa, chocolate, everything. So for me, I think transformative thing is the key is innovation, and that leads to the entrepreneurial spirit and so on. It works and everything works out.
And
I
how
think
do
that for me
you,
is innovation.
yeah, I mean, I agree with you, like, encouraging innovation and entrepreneurship. I guess, like, I know I said the last one was the last question, but, recognizing this conversation that we had, that I could recognize that one, you're a very knowledgeable individual, and two, I could see the passion that you have. Where does that come from? What motivates you after 13 years? That's a long time.
Yeah, it is.
What is motivating you right now to keep at it? Is it your being a father? Is it that, what is this
It's,
drive? What keeps you focused like this?
well, what motivates me is very simple. It's something I enjoy. I've always loved international relations. From BUE, I've always anxious. I remember even my career aspiration was actually to be a diplomat, and I've always had the idea of wanting to see new cultures, meet different people, speak different languages, just learn. Because I know we are no one space children, children are just a drop in the ocean when it comes to the whole global thing. So I've always wanted to learn, speak people, and I'm fortunate because with my wife and I, when we together, we make it a habit of traveling, seeing new places, and we encourage that with our children to go out there because there are limitless opportunities for everyone. And
Wow.
I think that's what it's just the idea of curiosity for me.
It helps to be working in a field that you actually enjoy,
Yeah,
essentially.
yeah,
So that's it's a blessing. It's a blessing.
it is.
Okay.
It is. Okay.
Thank you for this conversation. We've been talking for
Yes,
almost
Joshua.
an hour now. I hope we can talk some more.
Of course, certainly, certainly. I enjoyed
Yeah,
it
because
very much.
me too. And no, really, truly. And I also think, what, like with Trump coming in, and he has this policy of not sanctions, but tariffs, right? It seems to be using this as sort of a strategy for his interaction with the world. We're gonna have a lot to talk about when it comes to, the Caribbean's focus, the Caribbean strategy for sort of mitigating the threat of Trump's new
Yeah,
presidency, right? Like, what do we do with tariffs? That would cripple our economy, essentially. Trinidad and Tobago,
yeah, it
cripple
is.
everybody in the Caribbean. United States is a big boy. So we have, we could carry this conversation on further, and now
Of
realize
course.
that we didn't talk
Yeah.
about tariffs on the United States and those threats, but be a good next conversation. So thank you, sir.
Okay, Joshua, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No problem. We'll see you soon. Bye.
Okay. Bye.